For 5 years, mailman Robert Hayes delivered letters to 1247 Maple Street, a house that had been abandoned since 2018. Every week, the same mysterious envelopes arrived, addressed to someone who didn't exist, for a home where no one lived. Robert followed protocol, stuffing them through the broken mail slot into darkness. But the day those letters stopped coming, Robert made a decision that would uncover a secret so shocking it would change 3 families forever and expose a conspiracy that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. But to understand why Robert's simple decision to look inside that mail slot would expose a conspiracy spanning 3 decades, you need to know about the letters themselves. Letters that weren't just mysterious because of where they were going, but because of who was sending them. Because the return address belonged to someone who had been dead for 23 years. The morning mist clung to Maple Street like a shroud as Robert Hayes made his way through his route, the familiar weight of his mailbag pressing against his shoulder. At 54, Robert had been carrying mail through the suburbs of Cedar Falls for 26 years, long enough to know every dog's bark, every resident's schedule, and every house's secrets. But 1247 Maple Street had become his greatest puzzle. The house stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, its once pristine white siding now stained gray with neglect. Weeds had overtaken the front yard, growing tall enough to reach the broken windows on the first floor. The front porch sagged under the weight of accumulated leaves and debris, and the mailbox, a simple black metal box mounted beside the door, bore the scars of 5 harsh winters without maintenance. Robert remembered when the Hendersons had lived there. Margaret Henderson had been a retired librarian who always offered him lemonade on hot summer days, while her husband Frank spent his mornings tending to a garden that was the envy of the neighborhood. They had moved to a nursing home in 2018 after Frank's stroke, and the house had stood empty ever since, or so everyone thought. The first mysterious letter had arrived on a Tuesday in September 2018, just 3 weeks after the Hendersons had moved out. Robert had been surprised to see mail addressed to Eleanor Whitmore at the abandoned address. He'd knocked on the door out of curiosity, but the hollow echo that returned confirmed what he already knew. No one was home. Following Postal Service protocol, Robert had slipped the letter through the mail slot, listening as it fluttered into the darkness beyond. He'd made a mental note to check with his supervisor about mail forwarding, but by the time he'd finished his route, other concerns had pushed the incident from his mind. But Eleanor Whitmore's letters kept coming. Every Tuesday and Friday, without fail, the same elegant handwriting would appear on cream-colored envelopes, always with the same return address: H. Whitmore, 892 Oak Ridge Drive, Cedar Falls. Robert had driven past Oak Ridge Drive countless times over the years. It was a street of modest ranch homes built in the 1960s. He'd never paid attention to number 892, but now he found himself glancing at it whenever his route took him nearby. The house at 892 Oak Ridge was well maintained, with a neat front yard and curtains that suggested someone lived there. But Robert never saw anyone coming or going, never noticed a car in the driveway, never observed any signs of daily life. It was as if the letters materialized from thin air, appearing in his sorting facility with mechanical regularity. After 6 months of these mysterious deliveries, Robert's curiosity had gotten the better of him. During his lunch break one day, he'd driven to Oak Ridge Drive and knocked on the door of number 892. An elderly woman had answered, thin, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and eyes that held a sharpness that belied her frail appearance. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Robert had asked, showing his Postal Service ID. "I'm Robert Hayes, your mail carrier. I wanted to ask about the letters you've been sending to Maple Street." The woman's face had gone completely blank, as if Robert had spoken in a foreign language. "I'm sorry," she'd said slowly, "but my name is Dorothy Chen. I've lived here for 30 years. There's no one named Whitmore at this address." Robert had apologized, assuming he'd made a mistake with the house numbers. But when he'd checked the return address on the next letter, It clearly read 892 Oak Ridge Drive. He'd driven back to the street and counted house numbers carefully. 892 was definitely Dorothy Chen's house. The mystery had deepened from there. Robert had tried looking up H. Whitmore in the phone directory and city records, but had found nothing. He'd asked his supervisor about the situation, but had been told that as long as the letters were properly addressed and postage was paid, his job was simply to deliver them. Questions about the sender's identity weren't his concern, so Robert had fallen into a routine that had lasted 5 years. Every Tuesday and Friday, he would find Eleanor Whitmore's letters in his bag, walk to the abandoned house at 1247 Maple Street, and slip them through the mail slot. He'd grown accustomed to the sound they made as they fell into the empty house. A soft whisper followed by a faint rustle as they joined what must have been hundreds of other letters accumulating in the darkness. Sometimes, Robert would pause after making the delivery, studying the house and wondering about the letters piling up inside. Were they love letters, legal documents, family updates sent to someone who would never read them? The questions multiplied, but answers remained elusive. He'd also grown curious about the house itself. Despite being abandoned for 5 years, it showed no signs of vandalism or break-ins. The windows, though dirty, remained intact. The front door stayed securely locked. It was as if the house was being protected by some invisible guardian, preserved in a state of suspended animation. The neighbors had grown accustomed to Robert's twice-weekly visits to the empty house. Mrs. Patterson, who lived next door, had mentioned seeing him there and had asked if the Hendersons were planning to return. Robert had explained about the mail delivery without mentioning the mysterious nature of the letters, and Mrs. Patterson had nodded with the resigned acceptance of someone who had seen enough of life's oddities to stop questioning them. But even Mrs. Patterson didn't know what Robert had begun to suspect in recent months, that someone else was watching 1247 Maple Street. On several occasions, he'd noticed a dark sedan parked at the end of the cul-de-sac, its occupant apparently observing the house. The car never stayed long, and Robert never got a clear look at the driver, but its presence added another layer of mystery to an already puzzling situation. The letters themselves had remained remarkably consistent over the years. They were always addressed in the same careful handwriting, always used the same cream-colored envelopes, and always felt substantial, not just single sheets of paper, but multiple pages of something important. Robert had never been tempted to open someone else's mail. His professional ethics were unshakable, but he couldn't help wondering what messages were important enough to send twice weekly to an empty house for 5 years. Then, on a gray Monday morning in October, something changed. Robert sorted through his mail as usual, organizing letters by street and house number. He reached the section for Maple Street and paused. For the first time in 5 years, there was no letter for Eleanor Whitmore at 1247 Maple Street. Robert double-checked his sorting, thinking he might have missed it, or accidentally placed it with another street's mail. But after searching through his entire bag twice, he had to accept the obvious. No letter had come for Eleanor Whitmore that day. Tuesday arrived, and still no letter. Robert found himself oddly disappointed as he walked past 1247 Maple Street without stopping. The house seemed to stare at him accusingly, as if asking why he had broken their long-established routine. Friday came and went with no letter. Then, the following Tuesday. By the second Friday, Robert realized that the letters had stopped completely. After more than 5 years of clockwork regularity, the mysterious correspondence to Eleanor Whitmore had simply ended. That's when Robert made the decision that would change everything. Robert Hayes was not, by nature, a curious man. 26 years of mail delivery had taught him that most mysteries solved themselves given enough time, and that poking into other people's business rarely led to satisfying answers. But the sudden cessation of Eleanor Whitmore's letters had created a void in his routine that nagged at him like a splinter he couldn't quite extract. For 3 weeks he'd walked past 1247 Maple Street without stopping, and each time the silence felt heavier. The house seemed to be waiting for something, and Robert found himself wondering about those hundreds of letters accumulating in the darkness. What messages had been piling up for 5 years, unread and untouched? The decision came to him on a particularly dreary November afternoon. Robert had finished his route early and found himself driving past Maple Street instead of heading home. The abandoned house looked especially forlorn in the gray light, and before he fully realized what he was doing, Robert had parked his mail truck and was walking up the weed-choked path to the front door. The mail slot was exactly as he remembered it, a brass rectangle set into the lower half of the door, tarnished with age but still functional. Robert knelt down and tried to peer through it, but the opening was too narrow to see much beyond a glimpse of hardwood floor and shadows. That's when he noticed something that made his pulse quicken. The mail slot wasn't just an opening in the door, it was a passage into something that shouldn't exist. From his low angle, Robert could see that letters weren't simply falling onto the floor and staying there. Instead, they appeared to be organized, stacked, arranged with a deliberate care that suggested someone was collecting them. But that was impossible. The house had been abandoned for 5 years. Robert had been delivering letters to an empty building, dropping them into a void where they should have accumulated in random piles, collecting dust and slowly deteriorating. Yet what he glimpsed through that narrow opening suggested order, purpose, intention. Robert stood up, his mind racing. If someone was collecting the letters, that meant someone was inside the house. But who? And why maintain the pretense of abandonment? Why allow the exterior to decay while secretly living inside? He walked around the house, studying it more carefully than he ever had before. The windows on the ground floor were all covered from the inside. Not boarded up, but curtained with what looked like dark blankets or sheets. The windows on the second floor were similarly covered, except for one small window near the back of the house that appeared to have been left clear. Robert found a spot where he could see that uncovered window without trespassing on the property. At first, it looked as empty and dark as the rest of the house, but as his eyes adjusted, he noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. The faintest glow, barely perceptible, coming from somewhere deep inside the room. Someone was in there. Someone had been in there for 5 years, collecting Eleanor Whitmore's letters in secret. The implications hit Robert like a physical blow. He had been unknowingly enabling something. But what? Was this an elaborate fraud? A hiding place for someone running from the law? Or something more sinister? Robert's first instinct was to call the police, but he hesitated. What crime was being committed? Someone was living in an abandoned house and collecting their own mail. Technically, that wasn't illegal if they had the owner's permission, and Robert had no evidence of any actual wrongdoing, but the secrecy troubled him. Why go to such elaborate lengths to appear absent? Why allow neighbors and mail carriers to believe the house was empty if there was nothing to hide? Robert decided he needed more information before involving the authorities. That evening, he drove to the Cedar Falls Library and spent 2 hours researching property records. What he found deepened the mystery rather than solving it. The house at 1247 Maple Street was indeed owned by Frank and Margaret Henderson, who had moved to Sunset Manor Nursing Home in 2018. But the property records showed something Robert hadn't expected. The house wasn't abandoned in any legal sense. Property taxes were being paid regularly, utilities were maintained, and there had been no notice of abandonment filed with the city. Someone was taking care of the house financially, maintaining the facade of emptiness while ensuring it remained legally and practically habitable. Robert's research into the Hendersons themselves revealed a couple who had lived quiet, unremarkable lives. Frank had been a retired insurance adjuster, Margaret a librarian. They had no children, few relatives, and had been model citizens for 40 years. Nothing in their background suggested any connection to mystery or deception. The next step was investigating the mysterious H. Whitmore, who had been sending the letters. Despite his earlier failures, Robert tried again to locate any record of someone with that name in Cedar Falls. This time, his library research yielded results that chilled him to the bone. Harold Whitmore had indeed lived in Cedar Falls, at 892 Oak Ridge Drive, the address on the return envelopes. But Harold Whitmore had died in a car accident in 2001, 23 years ago. The accident report described a single-vehicle collision on a rainy night, with no witnesses and no suspicious circumstances. Harold had been driving home from his job at the Cedar Falls Electric Company when his car had skidded off the road and struck a tree. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Harold's obituary revealed that he had been survived by his wife, Eleanor Whitmore, who had continued living at 892 Oak Ridge Drive after his death. But Eleanor's own obituary appeared in 2003, just 2 years after her husband's death. She had died of cancer at the age of 67, with no surviving relatives and no children. After Eleanor's death in 2003, the house at 892 Oak Ridge Drive had been sold to Dorothy Chen, the woman Robert had met when he'd knocked on the door. Dorothy had been telling the truth. She had lived there for decades and knew nothing about any Whitmores. But if both Harold and Eleanor Whitmore had been dead for more than 20 years, who had been sending letters twice weekly for the past 5 years? And who had been collecting them at the abandoned house on Maple Street? Robert sat in the library parking lot after making these discoveries, his hands trembling as he held the printouts of the obituaries. The logical explanations were running out. Someone was using the name of a dead man to send letters to a woman who had died 20 years ago, addressing them to an abandoned house where a secret resident collected them in darkness. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a picture, but it was a picture that made no sense in the rational world Robert had always inhabited. That night, Robert made a decision that went against every instinct he had developed in 26 years of respecting other people's privacy. He was going to find a way into that house and discover what was really happening at 1247 Maple Street. The plan came to Robert in the early hours of a sleepless night. He couldn't simply break into the house. That would be illegal and wrong. But he could approach it as a concerned postal employee investigating a potential mail fraud. If someone was collecting letters addressed to people who didn't exist, that was a federal crime that fell under Postal Service jurisdiction. Robert's hands shook as he dialed the number for his supervisor, Dave Morrison, the next morning. Dave was a practical man who had worked for the Postal Service even longer than Robert, and he listened without interruption as Robert explained the situation. "You're telling me you've been delivering mail to a supposedly abandoned house for 5 years?" Dave asked when Robert finished. "That's right, and the return address belongs to someone who died 23 years ago. There was a long pause before Dave responded. "Robert, this sounds like either an elaborate mail fraud or something worse. We need to handle this by the book. I'm going to contact the postal inspectors and the local police. Don't do anything else until you hear from me." But Robert couldn't wait. The mystery had consumed him, and he knew that once the authorities got involved, he might never learn the truth. That afternoon, instead of going home after his route, Robert parked at the end of Maple Street and walked to 1247. This time, he didn't hesitate. He knocked firmly on the front door and called out, "Postal Service. I need to speak with the resident about mail delivery issues." The silence that followed seemed to press against him like a living thing. But just when Robert was about to give up, he heard something that made his heart race. Footsteps, slow and careful, approaching from inside the house. A voice spoke from just behind the door, so soft Robert had to strain to hear it. "Go away. Please just go away." It was a woman's voice, elderly and frightened. Robert felt a mixture of relief and renewed concern. Someone was indeed living in the house, but they were clearly in hiding. "Ma'am," Robert said gently, I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm the mail carrier who's been delivering letters to this address for 5 years. I just need to understand what's happening here." Another long silence. Then, "You're the mailman? The one who brings Eleanor's letters?" Robert's pulse quickened. "Yes, ma'am. I've been bringing letters addressed to Eleanor Whitmore, but I've recently learned that Eleanor Whitmore died 20 years ago. I'm concerned that someone might be committing fraud using her name." "Eleanor didn't die 20 years ago." The voice was stronger now, tinged with an emotion Robert couldn't identify. "Eleanor died 3 weeks ago. That's when the letters stopped coming." The words hit Robert like a physical blow. "Ma'am, I'm looking at Eleanor Whitmore's obituary right here. It says she died in 2003. "That's the other Eleanor," the voice said. "Harold's Eleanor. But our Eleanor just died, and now I don't know what to do." Robert felt the world shift around him as understanding began to dawn. "Ma'am, could you please open the door? I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding, and I'd like to help if I can." "You'll call the police," the voice said. "Everyone will know." "I won't call anyone without your permission," Robert promised. "I just want to understand what's been happening here." Another long pause, then the sound of locks being turned. The door opened just a crack, revealing a thin slice of a face. An elderly woman with white hair and eyes that had seen too much. "My name is Dorothy Henderson," the woman said, "and I've been waiting 23 years for someone to care enough to ask the right questions." The interior of 1247 Maple Street was nothing like Robert had imagined. Instead of the dusty, abandoned shell he'd expected, he found himself in a home that was clean, organized, and clearly lived in. The furniture was old but well-maintained. The floors were swept, and every surface spoke of careful attention. But what dominated the living room were the letters. Thousands of them, arranged in neat stacks on every available surface. Tables, shelves, even the floor were covered with cream-colored envelopes, all addressed to Eleanor Whitmore in the same careful handwriting. Dorothy Henderson was a small woman, probably in her 70s, with the kind of fragile appearance that suggested she had once been much stronger. She moved carefully, as if every step required consideration, but her eyes were sharp and alert. "Please sit down," she said, gesturing to a chair that wasn't covered with letters. "I suppose it's time someone heard the whole story." Robert settled into the chair, his mind reeling from the scene around him. "Mrs. Henderson, are you related to Frank and Margaret Henderson?" Dorothy nodded. "Margaret was my sister-in-law. When she and Frank moved to the nursing home, they asked me to watch the house, not just keep an eye on it, but live here, take care of it. They said I could stay as long as I needed." "But why the secrecy? Why let everyone think the house was abandoned?" Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was supposed to be dead too, just like Eleanor." The story that Dorothy Henderson told over the next hour was one of love, loss, and a deception born from desperation. 23 years ago, Dorothy had been married to Harold Whitmore's brother, James. The two couples, Harold and Eleanor, James and Dorothy, had been inseparable, sharing holidays, vacations, and the deep bond that sometimes develops between couples who choose to be family. But in 2001, everything had changed. Harold's death in the car accident had devastated Eleanor, but it had also triggered something unexpected. In her grief, Eleanor had begun to believe that Harold was still somehow present, still communicating with her through signs and dreams and half-heard whispers in the night. "Eleanor started seeing Harold everywhere," Dorothy explained, her voice heavy with memory. She would have conversations with empty rooms, set 2 places at the dinner table, leave his coffee mug out every morning. The doctors said it was a normal part of grief, that it would pass. But it didn't pass. It got worse. James and Dorothy had tried to help Eleanor through her grief, spending time with her, encouraging her to seek counseling, trying to draw her back to reality. But Eleanor had become convinced that Harold was trapped somehow, unable to move on to whatever came after death, because she was holding on to him too tightly. She decided that the only way to free Harold's spirit was to join him, Dorothy said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She started talking about suicide, about ending her life so they could be together. We were terrified. In 2003, Eleanor had indeed died, but not from cancer, as her obituary had claimed. She had taken her own life, leaving behind a note explaining that she was going to find Harold, and that they would finally be at peace together. James and I made a terrible decision, Dorothy continued. We were afraid that if people knew Eleanor had killed herself, they would judge her, remember her for how she died instead of how she lived. So we lied. We told everyone she had cancer, that she died peacefully in the hospital. We even had a funeral with a closed casket. But their deception hadn't ended there. James, consumed with guilt over his inability to save Eleanor, had begun experiencing his own psychological breakdown. He became obsessed with the idea that Eleanor's spirit was restless, that she was searching for Harold but couldn't find him in death because of the lies surrounding their story. James started writing letters to Eleanor, Dorothy said, gesturing to the stacks of envelopes surrounding them. He believed that if he kept writing to her, kept telling her where Harold was, she would eventually find peace. But he couldn't mail them to her old address. Dorothy Chen lived there by then. So he mailed them here, to Margaret and Frank's house, using Harold's name as the return address. But why here? Robert asked. What's the connection to this house? Eleanor used to visit Margaret all the time when she was alive, Dorothy explained. They would sit in the kitchen and talk for hours about Harold, about their life together, about their plans for the future. James thought that if Eleanor's spirit was still searching, she would come here eventually. The letters were like breadcrumbs, leading her to a place where she had once been happy. The deception had continued for nearly 2 decades. James had written to Eleanor twice weekly, telling her about his day, sharing memories of Harold, explaining over and over where she could find her husband in the afterlife. Dorothy had helped maintain the fiction, even after James's own death from a heart attack in 2015. After James died, I kept writing the letters, Dorothy admitted. I used his handwriting style, tried to match his voice. I couldn't let Eleanor down. Someone had to keep guiding her home. But Dorothy's commitment to the deception had come at a terrible personal cost. After James's death, she had found herself increasingly isolated, afraid that anyone who got too close would discover the truth about Eleanor's suicide and the years of lies that had followed. When Margaret and Frank offered her the house on Maple Street, she had seen it as an opportunity to disappear completely, to live out her remaining years in the shadows while continuing her vigil for Eleanor's restless spirit. 3 weeks ago, I got the diagnosis, Dorothy said, her voice breaking. Pancreatic cancer. The doctor says I have maybe 3 months left. That's when I stopped writing the letters. I figured Eleanor and I would be seeing each other soon enough, and I could explain everything in person. Robert sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what he had uncovered. 3 families had been shattered by a single tragedy 23 years ago, and the aftermath had created a web of deception that had lasted for 2 decades. Mrs. Henderson, Robert said finally, you can't spend your final months alone in this house, hiding from the world. There are people who can help you, places you can go where you won't have to carry this burden by yourself. Dorothy shook her head. I can't leave. What if Eleanor finally comes looking for the letters? What if she needs me? It was then that Robert understood the final, heartbreaking truth. Dorothy Henderson wasn't just protecting Eleanor Whitmore's memory or maintaining James's delusion. Somewhere along the way, she had begun to believe it herself. 20 years of writing letters to a dead woman had convinced her that Eleanor's spirit was real, searching and dependent on her guidance. The next few hours were among the most challenging of Robert's life. He sat with Dorothy Henderson as she showed him letter after letter that James had written to Eleanor, then the ones she had continued writing after James's death. The correspondence told the story of 2 decades of grief, guilt and gradual descent into a shared delusion that had consumed 3 lives. But Robert also saw something else in those letters, a love so profound that it had survived death, madness, and the passage of time. James Whitmore had loved his brother Harold and sister-in-law Eleanor so deeply that he had spent 18 years trying to reunite them in the afterlife. Dorothy had loved James so completely that she had continued his impossible mission even after his death, sacrificing her own life to honor his memory. As the afternoon wore on, Robert gently convinced Dorothy to let him call her doctor. The conversation that followed confirmed what Dorothy had told him. She was indeed dying, and she had no more than a few months to live. More importantly, she had no family left, no support system, and no plan for her final weeks beyond continuing to live in secret at the abandoned house. "Mrs. Henderson," Robert said after ending the call, "I want to help you, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Dorothy studied his face for a long moment before nodding. "You're the first person in 5 years who's cared enough to ask questions. I suppose that means something." Robert's first call was to his supervisor, Dave Morrison. He explained the situation as clearly as he could, emphasizing that Dorothy was not a criminal, but a grieving woman who needed help. Dave listened without interruption, then promised to contact the appropriate social services agencies to arrange care for Dorothy's final months. The second call was more difficult, to Margaret Henderson at the nursing home. Margaret was 91 years old and suffering from early-stage dementia, but she was still lucid enough to understand when Robert explained that her sister-in-law Dorothy was living in her old house and was terminally ill. "Dorothy's been there all along?" Margaret asked, her voice filled with wonder. "We wondered what happened to her after James died. She just disappeared." "She's been taking care of your house," Robert explained. "And she's been taking care of something else, too. A promise she made to someone she loved very much." The third call was the hardest of all. Robert contacted Dorothy Chen at 892 Oak Ridge Drive and explained that someone had been using her address as a return address for letters. Dorothy Chen was initially angry, thinking she was the victim of identity theft. But when Robert explained the full story, her anger turned to sadness. "All these years, I wondered why that mailman had come to my door asking about Whitmores," she said. "I wish I had known. I would have tried to help." Over the following days, a small miracle occurred. The community that had unknowingly ignored Dorothy Henderson's suffering for 5 years rallied to support her once they learned of her situation. Margaret Henderson insisted that Dorothy should remain in the house for as long as she wished, with all expenses covered by the Henderson estate. Hospice care was arranged to help Dorothy manage her illness with dignity. But perhaps most importantly, Robert arranged for something that gave Dorothy peace in her final weeks. With the help of a local genealogical society, he tracked down distant relatives of Harold and Eleanor Whitmore, cousins who had lost touch with the family decades ago, but who remembered the tragic couple with fondness. These relatives confirmed what Dorothy had always hoped, that Harold and Eleanor Whitmore were buried side by side in Restwood Cemetery under matching headstones that bore a simple inscription, "Together, always." The cemetery records showed that Eleanor's grave had been visited regularly over the years, with fresh flowers appearing every month on the anniversary of Harold's death. "Someone has been taking care of them," the cemetery caretaker told Robert. "For more than 20 years, someone has been making sure they're not forgotten." It had been James, and then Dorothy, making secret visits to honor the couple whose love story had shaped their own lives so profoundly. On Dorothy's good days, Robert would visit her at the house on Maple Street. She would tell him stories about Eleanor and Harold, about their courtship during World War II, their wedding in 1947, their 44 years of marriage that had been a model of devotion for everyone who knew them. "They really did love each other that much," Dorothy would say. surrounded by the thousands of letters she had helped write. It wasn't madness, what James did. It was love. Love that was bigger than death, bigger than reason, bigger than anything else in the world. Dorothy Henderson died peacefully in her sleep on a Tuesday morning in January, exactly 6 months after Robert had first knocked on her door. Her final request had been simple. She wanted all of Eleanor's letters to be buried with her, so that she could deliver them personally when she saw Eleanor again. Robert stood at Dorothy's graveside on a cold winter day, surrounded by the handful of people whose lives had been touched by her story. Margaret Henderson had been brought from the nursing home in a wheelchair, her grandson holding her hand as they said goodbye to a woman who had sacrificed everything to honor a promise made in grief. As the service ended and people began to leave, Robert remained behind. In his pocket was the last letter James Whitmore had ever written to Eleanor, one that Dorothy had never mailed because James had died before finishing it. Robert had found it among Dorothy's papers, its final sentence cut off mid-thought. Robert knelt beside Dorothy's grave and buried the letter in the soft earth, completing the circle that had begun 23 years earlier with a car accident on a rainy night. The house at 1247 Maple Street stood empty once again, but this time it was a peaceful emptiness. The letters were gone, their purpose fulfilled. The mystery that had puzzled Robert for 5 years had been solved, revealing a love story that had transcended death and touched everyone who encountered it. And on Tuesday and Friday mornings, as Robert continued his route through the suburbs of Cedar Falls, he would sometimes pause outside the house and remember Dorothy Henderson, who had spent 20 years writing letters to a ghost, believing with absolute faith that love could conquer even death itself. In the end, perhaps she had been right all along. 6 months after Dorothy Henderson's funeral, Robert received a letter that would forever change how he thought about his job, his route, and the invisible connections that bind communities together. The letter came from a woman named Sarah Whitmore Delacroix, a grandniece of Harold and Eleanor Whitmore who lived in Portland, Oregon. She had learned about Dorothy's story through the Genealogical Society's newsletter and had driven to Cedar Falls to visit her great-uncle and great-aunt's graves. "Dear Mr. Hayes," the letter began, "I wanted to thank you for caring enough about a mystery to uncover a love story that my family never knew existed." Sarah explained that Harold and Eleanor had been the fairy tale couple of her father's generation, the aunt and uncle who had shown everyone what true love looked like. But after Harold's death, Eleanor had gradually withdrawn from family contact, and her suicide had been kept secret, even from blood relatives. "For 20 years we wondered what had happened to Aunt Eleanor," Sarah wrote. "We knew she had died, but the details were always vague. Thanks to your investigation, we finally understand why she couldn't live without Uncle Harold, and why James and Dorothy felt compelled to help her find him again." But Sarah's letter contained something more, a revelation that gave Dorothy's decades-long vigil a meaning that even she had never suspected. "Mr. Hayes, I need to tell you something that might surprise you. My family has been visiting Uncle Harold and Aunt Eleanor's graves for more than 20 years, leaving flowers every month on the anniversary of Harold's death. But we weren't the only ones. Every time we visited, there were fresh flowers that we hadn't placed, flowers that someone else had left for them. It was James, wasn't it? And then Dorothy. They were the guardian angels who made sure Harold and Eleanor were never forgotten, never alone." The letter went on to explain that Sarah's family had established a small memorial fund in Harold and Eleanor's name, designed to help people dealing with complicated grief, the kind of grief that doesn't fit into neat categories or prescribed timelines. Dorothy Henderson spent 20 years writing letters to someone she believed was lost between worlds, Sarah concluded. But I think Eleanor found what she was looking for long ago. She found people who loved Harold as much as she did, people who wouldn't let their story end in tragedy. In the end, isn't that what we all hope for? That someone will care enough to remember us with love? Robert finished reading the letter as he sat in his mail truck outside 1247 Maple Street. The house had been sold to a young family who were renovating it with care, restoring its beauty while honoring its history. Children's laughter now filled the yard where weeds had once grown, and the windows that had been covered in darkness now glowed with warm light each evening. As Robert folded Sarah's letter and prepared to continue his route, he realized that his job had never been just about delivering mail. He was a connector, linking people across time and distance, carrying messages that sometimes mattered more than anyone realized. Every letter he delivered was someone's attempt to reach across the void that separates all of us, to touch another person's life with words, love, or simply the acknowledgement that they existed. Dorothy Henderson had understood this better than most. She had spent 20 years ensuring that love letters found their way to their intended recipient, even if that recipient existed only in the realm of hope and memory. That afternoon, Robert made a decision that he would carry with him for the rest of his career. He would pay attention, not just to addresses and zip codes, but to the stories behind the mail he carried. He would remember that every envelope contained someone's attempt to connect, to communicate, to bridge the distances that life creates between us all. And sometimes, if he was very lucky and very careful, he might even help deliver a message that could change everything, just as Harold Whitmore's love letters had changed Dorothy Henderson's life, and Dorothy's dedication had changed his own understanding of what it meant to serve others with compassion and care. The mail truck rumbled quietly down Maple Street as Robert finished his route, but his mind remained with the story he had uncovered and the lessons it had taught him about love, loss, and the unexpected ways people find to care for one another. As he returned to the postal facility that evening, Robert found himself thinking about all the other mysteries that might be hiding in plain sight along his route. How many other houses held secrets? How many other letters carried stories that could change lives if someone cared enough to pay attention? But the story of 1247 Maple Street remained special, not just because it was Robert's first investigation, but because it had taught him that love doesn't always follow the rules we expect it to follow. Sometimes love expresses itself through impossible gestures, through decades of patient dedication, through the simple act of ensuring that someone's story doesn't end in forgotten darkness. The house at 1247 Maple Street still stands today, filled with the laughter of the Martinez family and their 3 young children. The new owners know nothing of the letters that were once delivered there, nothing of Dorothy Henderson's 20-year vigil or the love story that had played out in shadows and secrecy. But Robert knows. And sometimes when he delivers mail to the Martinez family, birthday invitations and school newsletters and all the ordinary correspondence of daily life, he remembers that every address has a story, and every story matters to someone. The letters to nowhere had found their destination after all. They had traveled from grief to understanding, from secrecy to revelation, from isolation to community. And in the end, they had accomplished exactly what James Whitmore had hoped they would. They had ensured that a love story was remembered, that 2 people who had found each other in life were not forgotten in death, and that the power of human connection could triumph even over time itself. Robert Hayes continues to deliver mail through the suburbs of Cedar Falls, carrying with him the knowledge that his job is about more than moving envelopes from one place to another. He is a guardian of stories, a witness to the invisible threads that connect us all, and sometimes, if he pays attention and cares enough to ask the right questions, he is the person who helps love letters find their way home.